Hello, and thank you for joining me today to dig into the Bible in this new week. My name is Becky, and I'm a missionary with Mission Aviation Fellowship, along with my husband Dave. We're here living in Kampala in Uganda. My annual Bible reading plan recently took me through the book of Jonah. It's a tiny little book in the Old Testament, but it's a pretty famous story, really. So God instructs Jonah to head to the Assyrian city of Nineveh to preach to the people there against the wickedness prevalent within that place. Jonah turns around and says, "No, thank you," and runs off in the opposite direction on a ship. And following a big storm and being tossed overboard, he's swallowed by a big fish and lives in the revolting and, I expect, pretty smelly stomach of said fish for 3 days until it finally vomits him up on the shore and off he goes to Nineveh. That's the story in a nutshell. And it's one of those great and very visual stories that we often use for Sunday school, telling kids about the great stories in the Bible. But as with all of these little stories, little bits in the Bible, there are always so many things that we can get out of them. And as I was reading through this time, I started to realize that there is a big difference between worshipping God and walking in full obedience to Him. I think often when I've come to this story, Jonah running away, there's this idea that he's also running away from his faith in God, that he was saying, I am done with it. I don't want this assignment, so I don't want you, God. I'm just going to run away from you. And yet, even though he was running from what God had called him to do, he still believed in and even worshipped God. We know this because when in the midst of that ferocious storm, the sailors on the boat asked who he was. This is what Jonah said in chapter 1 and verse 9. "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land." It's not I used to worship the Lord, the God of heaven. This is a very present tense. I'm running away from what he's asked me to do, but I still believe in him. He is still the God who made everything. He is still worthy of my worship. And we can find ourselves in a similar position sometimes, I think. We may have no problem letting people know that we believe in God, that we know who He is, that we know of His power and His magnificence and His might. And yet the way that we're living our lives is completely contrary to the guidelines in the Bible, to what God tells us to do. I grew up in a church. I'm a PK, a pastor's kid, and I think it's actually quite easy to learn what looks good on the outside. To be in a service and look like you're really a part of it, really worshipping God, and yet your lifestyle is definitely not living up to that performance. Or maybe, there is a specific request that God has made of you, like Jonah, and you really don't want to do it. You're running from it. I don't want to change jobs. I don't want to give up on an unhealthy relationship. I don't want to move. I don't want to let go of that sin. Obedience is always a choice for us. It's an act of the will. And it can be hard, even when we absolutely and fully know who God is, even when we love Him. Jonah's task of going to Nineveh was not an easy one. One of his contemporaries, Jonah, was a man called Amos, another prophet, who was preaching to the nation of Israel of their own impending destruction, that they would be overrun and taken from the land. And Assyria was the strongest power in that area of the world at this time, it was very, very, very likely to become the culprit of said destruction. And Jonah was told to go and preach repentance to those people, to preach that if they turned from their sins, that God would forgive them. He had to preach that message to the very people who would go on to overthrow his own nation. That is not easy. And it kind of helps you to understand a little bit more of his reluctance in going to that nation. Obeying God is not always an easy task. He has called us to live in a way that is countercultural, that is different to the way that the world lives. Even when we know him, even when we love him, even when we worship him, it can still be hard to follow after him. And yet that is so, so, so important for us. In John chapter 14, verse 23, Jesus himself said, "Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching." And in James chapter 1, verse 22, we read, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says." Obeying God's instruction for our lives is so important. And this example of Jonah, this minor prophet in the Old Testament, is a good reminder to us today to make sure that we're not doing what he did, claiming to follow after God while all the while refusing to do something that he's asked of us. It is so, so important that we have that recognition of who God is, the maker of heaven and earth, Lord of the land and the sea. It's so important that we worship him, but we need to make sure that we're not stopping there. We should work hard to bring our lives into line with the wonderful example that Jesus left us, even when it's not easy. You know, loving our neighbor is not always easy, but it's something that is so, so important for us to do. We can be worshiping God even when we're living in disobedience, but it won't lead to our very, very best lives. Even though it won't always be easy, following Jesus wholeheartedly is the very, 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 very best way to live. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope that this has encouraged you and maybe challenged you a little bit to think about the way that you're living your life. Worship God, yes, absolutely, but also obey him. That is the best way to do life. I'll be here again on Friday, so I'll see you then for some more thoughts from the Bible. See you then.